There is a small strip of land where France meets Spain, tucked between green hills and the Atlantic coast, where roughly 1 in 3 people carry a version of blood that almost never shows up anywhere else on the planet. When a team recently ran genetic and medical records from that region through modern AI-assisted analysis, hoping to finally settle a question doctors have argued about for a century, the software did not hand back a clean answer. Instead, it handed back something stranger, a pattern that stretches back tens of thousands of years, tangled up with a species that supposedly disappeared from Earth long before recorded history began. Stay with me, because by the end of this you may look at your own blood type differently. Let's start with the basics, because most people have never really thought about what Rh negative even means. Human blood carries 2 major classification systems. The first is the one everyone learns in school, A, B, AB, and O. The second is quieter, but just as important, the Rh system, named after the rhesus monkeys used in the original 1940s research that identified it. It comes down to one protein sitting on the surface of your red blood cells. Have it, and you're Rh positive. Don't have it, and you're Rh negative. Worldwide, positive dominates by a wide margin. Somewhere around 85% of humanity carries the protein, leaving roughly 15% without it. Rh negative blood is, statistically speaking, the exception almost everywhere researchers have looked. Except in one place. In the Basque country, that 15% balloons dramatically, into the mid-20s, and by some estimates, as high as a third of the population, depending on the specific valley and study. That is one of the highest concentrations of Rh negative blood recorded anywhere on Earth, and it has sat there, unresolved, for as long as scientists have had the tools to measure it. To understand why this particular population keeps showing up in genetics papers, you need to understand who the Basques actually are, because almost nothing about them fits the tidy story we usually tell about how Europe got populated. They are a relatively small group, settled around the Western Pyrenees on both the Spanish and French sides of the border, in a landscape of steep farmland, fishing towns, and stone houses that in some families have stood for many generations. On the surface it looks like an ordinary corner of old Europe. Underneath, there is a cluster of oddities that linguists, geneticists, and historians have been picking at for well over 100 years. Start with the language. The Basques speak Euskara, and Euskara does not belong to any known language family. Every other tongue spoken across Europe, Spanish, French, Italian, English, German, the Slavic and Scandinavian languages, can be traced back through branches of the Indo-European family tree to a shared ancestral root. Euskara has no such tree. It has no confirmed relatives anywhere in the world. Linguists call it a language isolate, a technical way of saying that it simply doesn't connect to the map that explains everyone else's speech. Some researchers argue it may predate the arrival of Indo-European languages into Western Europe entirely, meaning the ancestors of today's Basque speakers may have been talking in this valley long before most other European language families ever took root. That alone would make the Basques a curiosity. But then you look at the DNA, and the same strangeness shows up again, this time written in biology rather than grammar. Most European populations today carry layered genetic contributions from waves of migration, early hunter-gatherers, then farming populations that spread out of the Near East roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago, then herders arriving from the Eurasian steppe a few thousand years after that. Modern European ancestry is, genetically speaking, a blend of all three. Basque populations show a noticeably different mix, a stronger relative signature from those earlier hunter-gatherer and early farming groups, and comparatively less influence from the later steppe migrations that reshaped much of the rest of the continent. It doesn't mean the Basques are somehow purer or untouched by history. No population is a time capsule, but it does mean their genetic profile sits at something of an outlier position compared to their neighbors, and that outlier position is old. Then there's the blood itself. Alongside the high rate of Rh negative status, the Basque population also shows an elevated frequency of blood type O, which many researchers consider one of the older blood types in the human lineage, more common among ancient hunter-gatherer groups before farming populations diversified the mix. Put those three threads together: a language with no known relatives, a genetic profile skewed toward Europe's earliest post-Ice Age inhabitants, and blood chemistry concentrated at levels far above the global average, and you get something that reads less like a coincidence and more like a signature. Not proof of anything specific yet, but a signature worth chasing. And this is exactly where the theories start reaching into much older territory than most people expect. Because when a population shows this many unusual, ancient-leaning traits stacked on top of each other, a question naturally comes up: how far back does this thread actually go? Some researchers, when they look at the Rh-negative concentration alongside everything else, quietly raise a possibility that sounds almost too dramatic to take seriously at first. What if part of the answer isn't found in the ordinary migration story of modern humans at all, but reaches back to the other hominin species that once shared this same land, the Neanderthals? For a long time, popular imagination treated Neanderthals as a kind of evolutionary dead end, slow, brutish, doomed. That picture has been thoroughly overturned by decades of archaeology. We now know Neanderthals buried their dead with apparent care, crafted tools with real sophistication, used fire, treated injuries and illness within their groups, and survived brutal Ice Age conditions across Europe and Western Asia for a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of modern civilization. They were established across the continent long before modern humans arrived, and when the two populations finally did meet, they didn't just pass each other by. They interbred. That isn't speculation, it's written directly into the genome of most people alive today, whose ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa. Most people of European and Asian descent carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, small fragments of an extinct lineage still quietly present in living human bodies, tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthal died. These fragments are known to influence things researchers are still mapping in detail: aspects of skin and hair biology, immune response, and how certain bodies handle cold and disease. So here's where the thread tightens around the Basque case specifically. If any surviving European population were going to carry an unusually strong genetic echo from earlier inhabitants of the continent, logic suggests it would be a population that stayed relatively isolated in one region for a long stretch of time, sheltered in place while later migrations reshuffled the genetics of everyone around them. That is roughly the position the Basque country occupies geographically, a mountainous refuge tucked against the Pyrenees, historically harder to move through than open plains. So some researchers ask, carefully and with appropriate hesitation, could the Rh-negative trait be one of the inherited fragments passed down from that ancient interbreeding? Could the missing protein on those red blood cells trace back, in some indirect way, to Neanderthal ancestry? It's a genuinely compelling idea, and it's easy to see why it spreads. But honesty requires a clear caveat here, and it's an important one. Current genetic evidence does not confirm this theory. There is no established, peer-reviewed genetic line connecting a specific Neanderthal-derived gene variant directly to Rh-negative status in Basque populations. The idea is intriguing. It is not settled. And the gap between intriguing hypothesis and established fact is exactly the gap that separates a great story from real science. Other explanations remain very much on the table. Genetic drift within a historically small, semi-isolated population is a well-documented mechanism that can push a rare trait to unusually high frequency purely by chance, especially if that population went through population bottlenecks during past climate stress, such as the last glacial maximum, when many groups retreated into refuge areas across Iberia and southern Europe. It's also possible the trait carried some now obscure survival advantage in the past, though no clear candidate for what that advantage might have been has been firmly established either. The honest scientific position right now is that the concentration of Rh-negative blood in the Basque population is real, measurable, and unusually high, and that its ultimate origin remains genuinely unresolved. Now here's the part of this story that most people have never heard, and it deserves just as much attention as the mystery of where the trait came from, because it explains why scientists cared enough to study Rh-negative blood so intensely in the first place. For most of human history, this trait wasn't a topic of fascination. It was a source of quiet, repeated grief, and nowhere did that grief cut deeper than in pregnancy. Here's the mechanism, in plain terms. Imagine a mother who is Rh-negative and a father who is Rh-positive, a completely ordinary pairing. If their child inherits the father's Rh-positive status, there are now two different blood profiles present in one pregnancy, the mother's, which lacks the protein, and the baby's, which carries it. Under normal conditions, the placenta keeps the two blood supplies mostly separate. But that separation isn't perfect, and during the later stages of pregnancy, and especially during delivery, small amounts of the baby's blood can cross into the mother's bloodstream. When that happens, the mother's immune system encounters a protein it has never seen before, correctly identifies it as foreign, and does exactly what immune systems are built to do. It builds a defense against it. The first pregnancy almost always proceeds without any visible problem, because the immune response typically develops too late in that pregnancy to cause harm. The baby is born healthy. But the mother's immune system has now been sensitized. It has manufactured antibodies against the Rh protein and effectively filed away a blueprint for how to respond faster next time. This process is called alloimmunization. The cruelty in the mechanism is this: those antibodies are small enough to cross the placenta, unlike the larger red blood cells themselves. So if a second Rh-positive pregnancy follows, the mother's primed immune system responds immediately, sending antibodies across the placenta to attack the developing baby's red blood cells, sometimes causing severe anemia, organ strain, or fetal loss, well before birth. For generations, this played out in homes without anyone understanding why. A family would have one healthy child, and then face loss or serious complications with subsequent pregnancies, with doctors having no test, no explanation, and no way to intervene. It was often attributed vaguely to misfortune, weak constitution, or simple bad luck, when in reality it was a precise, describable biological mechanism. Nobody had identified it yet. The condition wasn't formally named until the very end of the 1930s, when a physician named Philip Levine, working at a hospital in New Jersey, investigated a case where a mother had a severe transfusion reaction to blood from her own husband, blood that matched her ABO type perfectly. That reaction shouldn't have happened under the blood typing rules known at the time, and it led Levine, along with colleagues, toward identifying the Rh factor as a previously unrecognized variable in human blood. Once named hemolytic disease of the newborn, the disorder could finally be studied properly instead of being written off as unexplainable misfortune. Understanding the disease, though, was not the same as being able to prevent it, and for years families continued to face the same pattern while researchers searched for an actual intervention. The breakthrough eventually came from an unusual angle. In New York during the late 1950s and early 1960s, a physician named John Gorman was studying immunology literature and became interested in an observation buried in the technical material, that the presence of an existing antibody could, under certain conditions, suppress a person's own immune response to that same antigen before it could fully develop. It wasn't presented as a treatment for anything specific, just a description of an immune mechanism. But Gorman recognized what it might mean for Rh disease, whose root cause was, fundamentally, memory, the mother's immune system remembering its first exposure and mounting a much stronger response the second time. Gorman partnered with an obstetrician, Vincent Frieda, who understood the clinical stakes firsthand from delivering babies affected by the condition. Together they proposed something that sounds almost paradoxical. What if you gave an Rh-negative mother an injection of ready-made Rh antibodies right after delivery, in the narrow window before her own immune system had a chance to build its own lasting response? The borrowed antibodies would clear away the small amount of the baby's blood cells that had crossed over, before her body ever noticed them well enough to remember them. Testing that idea required proving it wouldn't backfire, and because deliberately exposing anyone to Rh-positive blood carried genuine risk, the early clinical trials in this research were conducted with male volunteers at a New York correctional facility, under research protocols and ethical standards very different from what would be permitted today, a detail worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over, since it reflects the more troubling history of mid-20th century medical research. Volunteers who were themselves Rh-negative were given controlled exposure to Rh-positive blood cells. Some also received the experimental antibody serum. Researchers then monitored whether each man's immune system developed its own antibody response. In the men who received only the foreign blood cells, sensitization occurred as expected. In the men who also received the serum, it largely did not. The borrowed antibodies did their work quietly and then faded, leaving no lasting immune memory behind. That result held up, and it became the foundation for what's now called Rh immune globulin, commonly known by the brand name Rogam, first approved for clinical use in the late 1960s. An Rh-negative mother carrying or delivering an Rh-positive baby today receives this treatment, typically both as a precaution during pregnancy and again within about 72 hours after birth. The borrowed antibodies clear away any of the baby's cells that crossed into her bloodstream and then disappear before her own immune system can build the lasting response that once caused so much unexplained loss. It's a small, inexpensive intervention that quietly resolved one of the more heartbreaking unsolved problems in reproductive medicine, and most people who receive it today never learn the decades of grief and research behind why it exists. So where does that leave the deeper mystery? The one about why this trait concentrated so heavily in one small corner of Europe in the first place. Even with the medical side of the story fully explained, the origin question is still open. We understand what Rh-negative blood does. We know how to manage its risks safely. What we still don't have a confirmed answer for is why nearly a third of the Basque population carries it, while most of the rest of the world sits closer to 15%. The candidate explanations remain on the table side by side: possible inheritance from ancient interbreeding with Neanderthals, genetic drift amplified by long-term geographic isolation, and historical population bottlenecks, or some past survival advantage that hasn't yet been identified. No single theory has been proven, and no honest researcher currently claims otherwise. What can be said with confidence is this: the Basque population represents a genuinely unusual convergence of ancient traits, a language isolate with no confirmed relatives, a genetic profile weighted more heavily toward Europe's earliest post-Ice Age inhabitants than most of their neighbors, and a blood chemistry pattern concentrated far above the global norm. Whether that pattern is a distant echo of a vanished human relative, the product of chance amplified across thousands of years of relative isolation, or something else entirely, the data keeps pointing at the same conclusion: these traits are old, and whatever process produced them was set in motion a very long time ago. So here's what I'd genuinely like to know from you. Looking at everything laid out here, the Neanderthal hypothesis, the isolation and genetic drift explanation, and the possibility of some ancient survival advantage we haven't identified yet, which explanation feels most convincing to you for why one small population came to carry so much of the world's rarest blood? Drop your take in the comments, and if this kind of deep dive into the hidden history written into our own biology is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this story still waiting to be told.